Right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today to talk about best practices for online and hybrid math instruction. I'm sure there are a lot of competing interest for your time. So the fact that you're willing to spend this hour focusing on student learning and student success, I think says a lot about your commitment to students. If you have any questions or comments during this session, please feel free to put those in the chat. We have folks managing that. We have some time also set aside at the end of this session to respond to any questions that come up. And by the way, we'll be sending out the session recording and the slides afterwards. In today's session, we'll highlight the Carnegie Math Pathways approach and pedagogy and how our faculty and our network have transitioned into the online space. We're joined by a couple of faculty members who will share their promising practices and what they have learned by moving their StatWay and QuantWay courses online, as well as areas where they're looking to improve. If you weren't able to join us for the first video webinar in this series, I'll spend a few minutes describing the productive persistence framework that underpins so much of what we do with students and how we think about supporting their success. Our presenters today will be
Aaron Altos here. I'm an assistant professor of mathematics at Cuyahoga Community College in Cleveland, Ohio. I've taught a bit online, mostly pre-calculus during the summers. And then this past spring, I had the foresight to teach a quantitative reasoning class online, actually starting in January. And then with everyone else, I had the shift of the rest of my classes to online in mid-March. And so I was able to be the experienced one at my campus and help my colleagues transition their classes to online since I had had that enormous 2-month head start.
And I am Kelly Kolmetz. I am our Math Literacy Pathway Coordinator, as well as an instructor. I'm at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And I put what we're calling a Math Literacy Pathway. It's a quantitative reasoning pathway. I put that online about 5 years ago. And then was lucky to be able to pilot some of the virtual courses that CMP has created. So I have done that for about a year now. Of course, last spring with COVID, right? I had to figure out how to put my online courses into the virtual environment. And so that was a bit of a challenge. But I am currently helping to teach all of our instructors how to teach virtually for this semester. Our department has decided that even though our campus is open, that all of our math courses are being taught virtually. So I look forward to talking with you today.
All right, and my name is Dan Ray. I'm the lead for faculty development here at Carnegie Math Pathways. I work with our network of institutions and faculty as they prepare to teach CMP courses and as they work to improve student outcomes. Over the last several months, that has of course meant supporting faculty as they move in-person courses to both hybrid and distance learning. The statistic that you see here on your screen is probably not surprising to anyone on the call, that math is a huge barrier to student success and college completion. And it's this problem that Carnegie Math Pathways was created to address. Every year, 3 out of 5 first-time community college students nationwide are placed into remedial mathematics classes. And we see similar trends in four-year colleges and universities. Unfortunately, most of these students don't progress to a college level mathematics course and therefore don't advance in their academic career. This is the mathematics gatekeeper that so many students struggle to overcome. We also know that these trends disproportionately impact students of color and low-income students, perpetuating inequalities and dramatically impacting students' lives and their families' lives and even their communities. And again, these statistics are probably not surprising to anyone on this call, but it's worth pointing out that these are under normal circumstances. Given the challenges that students are facing in today's climate, we can only imagine how things might be trending. So Carnegie Math Pathways was designed to break the math as a gatekeeper cycle. Students in CMP courses succeed at significantly higher rates than students in the traditional math sequence. They also graduate, transfer, and earn four-year degrees at significantly higher rates than their matched peers. And this is the case whether courses are taught face-to-face or online. With all the challenges facing campuses due to COVID-19, it's of course critical now more than ever that our students continue to learn and progress towards their graduation. Our approach to course design focuses on acceleration, curriculum that includes engaging contexts, and a pedagogical approach that provides students meaningful learning opportunities. And the two focus points of today's session, targeted and social and emotional supports. I think it's worth pointing out that as educators, we are, of course, all designing learning situations, and hopefully you'll be encouraged to incorporate some of these ideas shared in this session in your courses. If you were able to join us for the first webinar in this series, we were able to do a much deeper dive into the productive persistence framework. Before handing things over to our two faculty presenters, though, I thought it would be helpful to at least briefly revisit these ideas. The concept of productive persistence is probably best described through an equation. Productive persistence equals tenacity plus the good skills, with the aim being for students to continue to put forth effort throughout the learning experience and that they use effective strategies. Research has shown that there are 5 categories or drivers of productive persistence. We know that students have to have a growth mindset, allowing them to believe that they're capable of learning. Many students enter their math courses with a fixed mindset, believing, for example, that you're either a math person or you aren't. And in many cases, these mindsets are the #1 predictor for student success. Students also need to have a sense of belonging, that they're connected to their peers, instructor, and their course. Ultimately, that they're a part of something beyond themselves. They should believe that the course has value. The materials that they are learning is beneficial to them, and that it will help them either on a personal level or as they enter their careers. We want students to have the skills and know-how to succeed. We want to support them in becoming self-regulated learners and ensure that they are not unproductively struggling with elements of our courses that are not part of the learning goals. Lastly, we want to support students at both the classroom and college level as they gain the skills and mindsets to be successful. So with this framework in mind, I'll hand things over to Kelly Kolmetz, who is the first of our faculty presenters.
Thank you, Dan. I am going to see if I can share this. Is everybody able to see okay?
Looks good.
All right. Sorry, everybody. You know, you'd think that after COVID and everything else that I'd be okay with sharing screens, but I always feel it's a good idea to check. All right, so what I'd like to start by talking about is what I actually do the first week of my virtual courses, and I'll explain why in a second. And that is to have an orientation session where I kind of walk them through what course products they're going to use, where to find things in our LMS, and basically just sort of explain the general policies for the course, that kind of a thing. And I also go through our first group work session together. I do require group work in my courses, and so one of the things that I like to do is to show them what I expect them to do in their groups, and kind of walk them through what their group sessions will look like every time when they are doing them. And to me, this helps to lay the groundwork for the semester. And especially in an asynchronous course, this can be very helpful for students when we're not meeting on a regular basis to just kind of, as I said, set the groundwork. But this really can be done at any point. So I actually didn't do an orientation session my first time and learned that I really needed one. And so it's okay to do one, for example, now, if you haven't done one yet. Or if you have done one, to do something like that as sort of a refresher for your students, especially if you notice or feel like things aren't going as well in class as maybe you would hope. So week 3 would also be okay. But one of the themes that you'll hear throughout my talk today is that you really want to think about what you do in person. And so as we think about transitioning to the virtual world, right, to the virtual environment, you know, do what you do in person. So one of the things that I would like, and I'm sharing screen, so I don't know if I can actually get at the chat. So Carolyn, I'm going to have to ask you, I guess. I forgot I'm sharing my screen. So, but one of the questions I would like you all to put in the chat is, what do you do in person to keep your students engaged? So thinking about what you were able to do in a face-to-face situation, right? We're now in week 3 for some people, 4, you know, possibly further for others. But what are some of the things that you do in person that help to keep your students engaged in class? And feel free to share those in the chat. And as I mentioned, I can see the chat is filling up, so that's great. Whatever you do in person, you want to try to do that virtually. You know that it works in person for keeping your students engaged, so we want to try to figure out a way to do it virtually. So as you consider what works in your in-person classroom, right? How could you make that happen in the virtual environment? And I'm guessing that's why a lot of you are attending. You're looking for some of those ideas. But some of the things, since I require group work, when I met in person, I would check in with the groups regularly. And so that is something that I make sure to do in my virtual classroom as well. In person, I used to personally talk with students before and after class and ask them, you know, how are things going? How was your weekend? Are you having trouble with the homework? Things like that. And I do that now. I still do that. And I do that, though, through email, so I can personally connect with students. One of the other things I did, since there's group work required, is that I would email students who missed class. So I do that in the virtual environment as well. And we'll talk about more about how do you keep students, or how do you get students to attend or do the work in a virtual environment. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But these are all things that you do want to try to do in the virtual environment. So thinking about what do you do in person, and then trying to make that happen in the virtual environment. So thinking about virtual classes, right? Group work can still be done. Discussions can still happen. Whiteboards can be used, right? Student work, a lot of people don't realize this, but in a virtual situation, student work can still be shared. Just about any active learning activity can be adapted and conducted in the virtual environment. So one of the things that I was worried about with my groups, how do I know that they're so in our LMS, we have a product where it allows us to meet with our classes virtually. And I would split my students into groups, and I never knew, because I could only visit one room at a time, I never knew what the other rooms were doing. And one of the cool things that I found out about is that you can use Google Docs and have the groups fill out, each group had a separate Google Doc, and that way I could monitor based on what the students were writing, whether they were stuck, whether they were off topic, whether they weren't writing anything at all. And those were groups that I knew I had to definitely visit their groups and check in on how they were doing. But it gave me a quick snapshot through the Google Docs of how all the groups were doing, very similar to what I would do in the classroom when you kind of glance around and see it, you know, how the groups are going. So the Google Docs were a good find for me. And there are also, as I'm sure with COVID, many cool apps that you can use if you're teaching synchronously or asynchronously. Some of these work better when you actually have a meeting time with your students. But I'm going to ask you all now, again, if you would in the chat, what is a tool that you are using? Because I know with all of the people who are here, I'm certain that there are some really cool tools that people have found. So if you would be willing to share some of your ideas in the chat. And I am going to, while you all are doing that, I'm actually going to try to get out of this for a second. I think I need to stop sharing. Well, that's not a good idea. Never mind, I'm not going to do that. But I do have a website, which we will make sure that you get in a little bit. But there is a website, Jennifer Baumgardner, who is an associate professor in the School of Education at LSU, Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. She has actually started a Google Doc where she lists all of the active learning practices that can be done in a physical classroom, and then talks about how you can adapt those into a virtual classroom. So things like think, pair, share, like groups, like how do you do, some of you may know something called a gallery walk, where students display different things and then walk around and look at what other students are doing. These can actually all be done virtually. And they work, I can tell you, because I've tried many of them. We could actually spend an entire workshop, several days worth, talking just about active learning practices. But I will be sure that you all do get a link to that Google Doc so you can see what she has and add to it even with some ideas of your own. So some other things that I would like to share. One of the other things that I do, again, for my virtual students, I didn't do this for my in-person, but I found it to be very useful for my virtual students. Virtual students can often get lost in what should I be doing. I teach a co-requisite course, so the students actually have work to do, well, 4 days a week. If we were meeting in person, we would meet 4 days a week. So that's a lot for students to have to do online and keep track of what they should be doing each day. And so I provide what I call weekly hints about just what they need to be doing for that week. And I post this in our LMS. So the weekly hints, students have said, is actually very helpful for them. and it helps them to keep on track. What you're seeing on my screen, hopefully you can at least see part of it. I don't know if you can read all of it, but this is from a class that is currently meeting right now. Actually, the week 3 was last week. They're meeting synchronously 4 days per week. So actually week 3 is this week. So this is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday this week, fresh off the press. This particular class, they do actually meet in their, through our LMS and have class as they would in person 4 days a week. So, but these weekly hints are very helpful for students. One of the other things I do, I mentioned I send email. This is, again, I mentioned I do a lot of group work, and this is an email that I sent to one of the groups, and it just says, I know you've been struggling with some of the problems. I'm sorry I have not been able to join you when you first were struggling, but I wanted to let you know it's okay, blah, blah, blah. So I want to make sure that students are reading email though, so I do not send 50 email messages. I try not to send them too often. Sometimes I send messages like this that go out to the whole group. Sometimes I do send individual messages, but I really try to make the students go to the LMS for announcements and things like that. One of the other things that I would like to point out here, if you can see, again, it's kind of small, but I use lots of emojis and exclamation points. Actually, there is a lot of research that shows that students respond to that. They really feel like, and that you're talking to them and using some emotion. So anyway, just thought I would mention that because I always get comments from the students on my emojis. So one of the other things I did want to be sure to mention is please be sure to use support from your colleagues. I have learned that I'm not the very best at creating things from scratch, but if someone gives me something, I can usually repurpose, adapt, or otherwise make it work for my situation, for my students or my course. And I'm always trying to think about what works in person and then adapting that to the virtual environment. And I have gotten some great ideas from colleagues. So please, don't forget about the colleagues and don't forget about your students. Don't be afraid to ask your students for input. And, just like you would in person, you may have figured out different ways to do things. You may have to figure out different ways to do things in the virtual environment. So, you have to use email. You can't talk to them directly. You could call them. If you have access to that, that would be something, depending on your institution, if that's allowed or not. But there's surveys, many LMS allow polling, different things like that to find out how things are going for your students. I do want to share a couple of tips from colleagues of mine. I mentioned using your colleagues. One of the comments I get a lot is, yeah, these are all great if the students show up. So what happens if I have a synchronous class and the students don't come? These active learning techniques are great if the students are there, but how do I get them to get there? And some of the things that colleagues have found that actually work is extra credit. And what do I mean by that? That students will do just about anything for, just a half a point even of extra credit. And so one of the things is that, especially after COVID hit, there was a real drop-off in attendance, and the instructor had tried everything to try to reach the students who were not attending. And one thing that really worked for her was that she offered extra credit to students who could get the other absent students to start attending. And she said it was awesome. She couldn't believe, I think she ended up having like half of her missing students ended up showing up because of peer interactions. So extra credit to students who can get absent students to attend. I have another colleague who also uses group work and really relies on something that we call a group noticing routine, where you notice who's there in your group and you contact them if they're not there. This particular colleague actually offers extra credit to groups who have all of their members there for that day. So just some ideas of how to actually get those non-attending students to try to attend. Something else I wanted to share. This is a sample course survey, and again, the type is kind of small, but these are just questions like, and this is anonymous for my students, more for me to see how things are going. So, you know, I'm able to navigate the Canvas site. We use Canvas. I'm able to navigate the, you know, we use Pathways, you know, a Realize It site. But whatever your product is that you use, I know how to contact my instructor if I need to. I understand what assignments and activities I need to complete. Those kinds of questions, just to see how things are going at the midpoint. I also include, this is only a few of the questions, but I do make sure to include 3 open-ended questions at the end of the survey. What are 2 things that are working well so that I, as the instructor, can continue to do them? Similar, right? What are 2 things that are not working well so that I, as the instructor, can try to change them? And then I also say suggestions for how I might change them would be appreciated as well. And the last question I always want to ask is there anything else that I, as the instructor, should know about your experience in this course? That's a chance for those students who maybe haven't been attending or have been having trouble with the homework, or, you know, are having issues with their groups, where they can actually talk about that. I do tell students at the top of the survey that it's anonymous, but if they wish to share their names, they certainly can, and I will get back to them if they do include their names. So that's it for my part for now. I'm going to hand this off to Aaron.
Okay, hopefully I've got the slides up. So like Kelly said, we do a lot to try to replicate the things that we do in class and use tools and find ways that we can do those things. Other times it's not so easy to translate, so I think a little bit more about what are the things that I'm hoping to accomplish in class and what are the ways that I can try to accomplish those things. I focus a lot on building community in the class, and I'll talk about 3 different ventures that I'm working on: a question of the day, a way that I can create and sustain a culture of productive struggle in the class. So not only building community, but building community around the experience that we hope to have of struggling productively throughout the course. And then lastly, ways that I can improve how I've used discussion boards, which I've done a lot in the past, a lot of trial and error and mostly error, but I've done I went through some Quality Matters units this summer and some more professional development to try to get some better strategies on my discussion boards. And so I'll share with you some of those things too. The question of the day is something that I've been doing for years in my classes. I do it every single day. When I am a substitute, I even do a question of the day, even if I'm only there for 1 day. But I start every class with it. It gets students in the mode to talk to one another. It helps them learn each other's names. I explain this to them on the very first day. These are the reasons that we do a question of the day. I frequently will have a student coming from like a psychology lecture where they just sat silently for 2 hours and they need to get out of that listening mode and into an active mode. And so question of the day helps with that too. We'll take a minute to have you all answer this question of the day. So the way we do it is that everybody has to answer, and you say your name. If you're we'll do this in the chat, so your name will automatically populate there. And you can answer the question any way that you like. Would you rather live in a place where it snowed every day or a place where it was never below 100 degrees? And I like this question because it's one of the quicker ones for students to answer, but the students seem to, I think people in general seem to have a really difficult time understanding people who answer opposite from what they do. I'm definitely, I need the snow, but we can answer this question any way that you like. So I'm going to say it's, you know, it snows a little bit at some point, and then maybe it gets up to like high 40s, low 50s. The sun comes out. Those are the kind of nice Cleveland days that I like in the winter. So it doesn't have to snow all day, every day. Now, I don't usually get to actually see my class as a whole currently. So when they're working in their group assignments, I send out a question of the day and I ask them to cover it in their group before they get started. Another option might be to use the Remind app and to actually just send out a question of the day every day. And students can reply on Remind as just a way to continue to build community outside of the actual class activities that they're engaging with. I put up a few other questions of the day so you can see kind of the assortment. I've got a nice long list and a link that we're going to share with you about all my questions of the day. That's a great math question. Is that Celsius? I should probably specify that. I like to, over time, try to get questions that are a little bit more personal, less superficial, I guess. I think the first couple of questions here are fairly easy to answer. The ones toward the end are a little bit deeper. You know, you're revealing a little bit more when you answer a question like, what would my life slogan be? And mine, I'm stealing it from the movie Spinal Tap, where the drummer says, have a good time all the time. That would be my slogan. Or giving yourself life advice. So those questions I work up to as the students get more comfortable with each other and learn about each other more. So superficial at first and getting a little bit deeper as we go on in the semester. In terms of creating a culture of struggle and productive struggle and sustaining this kind of culture, I used this, and actually I was motivated to create this for my orientation, where I feel like I could talk for 45 minutes at least about what my goals and expectations for the class are, what my philosophy around teaching math is, how I want my students to, you know, what I want them to do in class, how I want them to feel about math class. I could go on, but I wanted to boil it all down to just one slide where I'm hoping to set expectations for this culture of productive struggle and also give my introduction to the course and about myself and my philosophy as an instructor. So I took this excerpt from research, which has informed a lot of the curriculum and pedagogy design that I've been involved with over the last about 10 years or so. And then the picture is a painting from Mary Cassatt. And the idea to look at this painting in terms of productive struggle, actually, I give credit to Karen Gibbon, who is a researcher at UCLA. It was her idea. I'd love to say it was mine, but she's posed this image as the depiction of productive struggle. And so I read this quote to the students. I won't read it to you, but it's basically about why we value having struggle in class and the kind of productive struggle that we want to be experiencing. And then I talk to the students about this picture, and I basically say this. I say, this picture depicts my philosophy to teaching. The baby, all of the students, you're the baby. I, as the instructor, I'm the mom. The apple is the math that we're trying to learn in this class. And what is the mom not doing? The mom is not just grabbing that apple off of the tree and feeding it right into the baby's mouth. The mom is pulling the branch down lower so the baby can be the one to grab that apple. That's how I view the math class that we're going to have this semester. I'm not going to be lecturing. I'm not going to be taking the math knowledge and cramming it down your throat. I'm going to bring it within reach, and you're going to be the one that has to make that effort to grab the apple. I think there are some other interesting things about this picture that are also representative of my approach to teaching. So who's the main character in the picture? I think the baby is really the main character. The mom is sort of in the background. And again, that's how I view teaching. I'm not the center of attention in the math class. I'm the whole, you know, not sage on the stage, God on the side type of thing. And here's the image that depicts that. The mom definitely has a very important role, and she's supporting that baby and bringing the branch down. So I'm hoping to convince my students that I'm their support, I'm their advocate, I'm helping them through all of this, but you're not going to find me taking that apple and feeding it to you. I'll be there supporting you. The naked baby, you could say, is like the vulnerability of some of our students, but I'm there in that supporting background role. And I'm hoping that so I've used this in my orientations, but it's also something that can be used as a booster several weeks into the semester when students are struggling but not in a productive way, and they need to feel supported. They need to understand that it's expected that they experience some kind of struggle, that this is really attached to the learning processes. How do we learn? How do we learn things if there was not some kind of struggle that we had to experience? I'm using more discussion board assignments. Something else, again, that's been, some trial and error for me. I think that the biggest shift in my approach has been that I'm not looking to have, I'll just tell you what I did in the summer. I would have at least 2 discussion board threads per week, and students were expected to participate in at least 1. That was what my expectation was. I'm going to now have many fewer discussion board threads and try to have each one go deeper. They were all very superficial, and they just didn't live up to the expectations that I had in mind. So my discussion board assignments now, they do them in small groups. I don't want to have a class of 30 students all in one discussion board thread. That's a good way to keep things superficial and to not really get deep into any topic. I also make sure that I am involved in their discussion boards. I can chime in and participate in an actual discussion. I also am there to give early feedback and let them know whether they are meeting expectations or how I can try to advance the discussion for them. So I am there with them. It's not something where I set it up on Sunday and then I look at it on Friday and see how it went. In terms of my experiences where I did not see responses that lived up to my expectations, I understand now that I can assess whether students are actually prepared to participate in a particular question or discussion topic. And I have a couple of examples on the next page where I'll touch on some of these items. But a pre-assessment, I think using a poll is a great way to do it. I saw in the chat someone mentioned that they're going to be using Kahoot. There is which is a polling tool. There's an option in Kahoot, I think it's called Student Paced, where you don't have to have everyone there at the same time doing it. Poll Everywhere is another tool that you can use for polling. And what I will do is I'll ask them some mathematical questions to see, do they have the background skills to be able to contribute a constructive comment to the discussion, and also to see if they have the right understanding of the context to be able to participate. So I don't just put a thread out there and cross my fingers. I understand now I can get a sense of, are they ready to dive into this question? And if they're not, I need to give them some sort of instruction or support to get them to a place where they can have a productive discussion. I want the topics to be relevant as much as possible. This connects to a few things. It helps them build that culture of belonging when they are all engaged with something that is relevant to their lives, that they're not all individually searching for, why do I care about this topic? It brings the course content more within reach. The students are more likely to learn in a class when they think that the material is relevant. I also will sometimes use roles. So I don't need every student to think that their job is to read the prompt and write a response. Some students can be facilitating the conversation. They're not actually giving answers, but they're commenting on other people's responses and trying to advance the conversation. There could be other roles where some students engage in the discussion and others are more of an observer. And then at the end of that week, then they switch roles and the observers participate in a discussion and the ones who had discussed observe, and then we have some peer-to-peer debrief after that. I guess the most important thing in terms of how do I get them to meet my expectations is I have to make those expectations very clear. And I also think it's valuable to have some sort of criteria for assessment. Not to say that every discussion board is graded, but that you do make a decision about that. So I have some discussion boards that are not graded. I want the students to just answer openly and to not have any concern about, is their response worthy of credit in this case? There are other topics where I am very clear about assessment. It is worth this many points. You must post 2 times this week. You must do this. Your answer must include numbers. So I have specific assessment criteria and expectations. The expectations I have basically sort of 2 kind of in general guidelines that I set in my syllabus and at the very launch of the discussion board. And then in each thread, I have additional expectations that I list. So the 2 guidelines that they should always know is that their job in the discussion board is to advance the conversation. If someone has written an answer and they would have wanted to write that exact same answer, they should not write that exact same answer. They should be doing something that advances the conversation. And of course, I can't just say like, hey, advance the conversation. You know what that means, right? So also I picked up this idea of using a 3 CQ, like letters CQ format. So when students are kind of feeling a little bit lost and what do I do to advance a conversation, you post a reply using the 3 C and 1 Q format. So you will post a compliment, a comment, a connection, and a question. So if someone posted the exact same thing you would have posted, you still have some ideas where you can say, that's a great answer. I was thinking the exact same things. Or you can make a comment if someone did something that was slightly different, or you had a thought that they didn't talk about and you want to know like, hey, did you think the same thing that I did? There's a question in there. And connection is, how does this relate to something else that we've done in class? So I'm giving students more guidance about the different ways that they can participate. The other guideline is you have to use math. I mean, I teach math. So I don't want to have any answers where people talk about this, it's a lot. Don't tell me something is a lot when you can tell me it's in the millions. Give me actual numbers. Show me your calculations. Make sure that you're talking about math. This was another one that I should have known, but I guess it caught me by surprise this summer in my pre-calculus class, where it was rare for me to at first see a discussion board post about a mathematical topic that actually used math. And so I want to make clear, yes, we want to have good discussions and we want to build community, but let's also make sure we're using good math language and using actual quantities. And then lastly, with these discussions that I want to go deeper, I know that I need to build the students up to doing those. I'm not able to just set that discussion thread out there and expect that it's going to be a nice, long-lasting, developing, evolving conversation.
Aaron?
So, yes.
Before we get into this, one of the questions in the chat was about the number of discussion threads per week. When you were talking about that, was this in the context of your asynchronous class or a synchronous class?
This was in an asynchronous class. But I guess I would also kind of put out there that I'm still very much in the experimental stage, like the trial. I've never left the trial part of trial and error. I had a lot of error, but I still am doing a lot of trial. So I'm kind of sharing like what my best strategies and approaches are for now. But I'm not saying that they'll be exactly the same when I do this all again in January. But yeah, this has been predominantly for asynchronous classes.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So this is one of my discussion board assignments, and the style that I'm using here is a questions without question. And you can participate in the chat if you're up to doing some mathematics right now. Calculators are allowed. And what I've done here is I want students to have a discussion, tell me anything mathematical or quantitative about this. A hairstylist is reviewing sales data from the previous month. The revenue from services was $4,600, which translated to a net profit of $2,800. by selling hair care products, she brought in an additional $710 in revenue, which earned her another $105 in profits. So at first, I'm okay with students saying anything, truly say anything quantitative about this. She made more money from the services than from selling products. Great, okay. Now I can chime in and say, like, how much more? And then when we get to talking about percents, we can come back to this question and say, what sorts of percents make sense or are informative about this scenario? I can try to connect this also to some things that are actual real life things. So once the students get to a point where they're figuring out, like, okay, what percent of her profit comes not from hairstyles, but from selling product. Now, would you be curious to know, like, in the hair industry, what is sort of the goal for a salon? What percent of their profit should be from selling hair care products? And I can ask them to do some internet search, which could take them in a lot of different directions. So it's something where I've kept it open enough that they can take this into several different directions based on the topics that we're covering over the course of the semester. Once we get to modeling, I could say, how could we make a model for her profit over time? What assumptions would we need to make? What other information would we make? If she's going to be increasing by 10%, so now into exponential, if she's going to be increasing by 10% per month, what is she going to be after 6 months? Is this reasonable? What assumptions are we making? So I've put just a kernel out there that can go into different directions based on the math topic of that lesson or that week or that chapter. Some other discussion board assignments. So the middle one is one actually that I used in a pre-calculus class, but I'm going to use it, I think, in all of my classes. It's within reach, I think, for all the classes that I teach. What's the total distance that your finger has moved on a touchscreen, phone, tablet, etc.? So how far have you swiped, basically? And this was the question where I got answers like, wow, I'm sure it's a lot. No numbers. So I'm going to pull them on this question first. I'm going to ask them to do some conversions. I'm going to ask them how many feet are in a mile. The way that this entire thread actually looks is, after this prompt, I ask them, you have to describe your strategies, your assumptions, your calculations, then find a real life example that represents your answer. Like, is it from downtown to the Eastern Campus? So that's going to be a question that I'll ask in the poll. What is the distance from downtown to the Eastern Campus? Or if I stand downtown, tell me something that's 40 miles away. So I'm understanding that they're equipped to answer those kinds of questions, so that when they get to this question, they have already sort of had experience with saying, like, okay, now I know that I've swiped 142 miles. How will I figure out what is 142 miles away from where I am now to be able to give the complete answer for this discussion board? The last one is an example of having this sustained conversation over time. So I start, again, very open. Which movie was more successful? I have a couple of examples I can give them. Eventually, they're going to come up with their own pair of movies. I intentionally picked one that's fairly recent with one that's at least 25 years old. And so they'll have a very open discussion about which is more successful. And if it's Die Hard, they could talk about the cultural impact that movie has had. Eventually, I want them to bring it back to quantity, specifically box office revenue. So then I say, okay, go find, which movies made how much money at the box office. I'll have them have a discussion about, are their sources reliable? So what website did they go to? How do they know that it's reliable information? Then we'll get to proportions and eventually the context of consumer price index and adjusting for inflation. So now we come back to this discussion and say, when you looked up those box office revenues, did you find numbers that were adjusted for inflation or not? And if they're not, how would we adjust for inflation? And if they were, can you verify? And then we can talk about the different mathematical ways that they could do that. So are you adjusting for inflation by setting up a proportion, or are you setting up a unit rate? What are the different ways that we know that we have a proportional relationship? So this is And then lastly, it can be now pick your own pair and tell us about which movie was more successful. And now I can expect them to research information, be aware of whether it's been adjusted for inflation or not, and talk to me about the mathematical approaches that they used. So we're getting close to the end here. To gather more information about the specific curriculum and programs that Kelly and I and many others are offering, this website has some great information. And I'll let Dan chime in and help guide us into the Q&A portion if he's still has power, if the hurricane hasn't landed.
I still have power. Yeah, my apologies earlier. I am in Florida, currently experiencing feeder bands from Hurricane Sally. Thank you, Aaron. And the website that he had up there, Carnegie Math Pathways, for anyone interested in our curriculum. If you've heard of StatWay and QuantWay previously, it was more of a challenge to teach our courses. They would have to be adopted by your institution, but we do have individual faculty adoption available now. And as he mentioned, you can find more information at carnegiemathpathways.org. But we do have 5 minutes left here at the end, so I would like to turn things over for Q&A for both Aaron, Kelly, or myself. Feel free to use the chat for any questions that have come to mind during this session. Thank you. Well, I was just going to say, just a reminder, you will receive the recording in the slides to these sessions. So if there was anything that came up that you were interested in that you didn't get a chance to jot down. Thomas asked, though, how would one engage students that you teach correspondence and are not allowed to meet in person due to restrictions? Gotcha. Maybe for clarification here, Thomas, whenever you say that they're not allowed to meet in person, are they able to meet virtually? Oh, no internet access. I've got you. I will pose that to Aaron and Kelly, but it sounds like that very much eliminates any method of synchronous collaboration.
Thomas, I have a question. Do your students have, I know you mentioned no internet, but are they able to, do they have phone service? I know that cell power, okay, all right. Yeah, that would be harder, much harder, actually. It takes a special kind of person to be able to do correspondence where it's just basically mailing back and forth. Let me think about that a minute. If I can add anything to that. And as far as another Thomas, different Thomas, how do we administer tests and collect assignments? I do that through our LMS. Our institution has a learning management system. We use Canvas. I've also used Blackboard and Desire to Learn, or D2L. So I administer my tests through our learning management system. And I also have students upload assignments that way. They can take pictures with their phones and then upload them to our LMS. Now, if you don't have access to an LMS, there are other things you can use, Google Classroom, things like that. But that's what I personally do. Aaron, there's a couple questions for you, or if you want to chime in on either of these.
Yeah, real quick, I do the same thing. I use Blackboard for assessments and for tests. I would say that I'm trying to really execute a shift in how I use tests. So I'm trying to do a lot more of assessment in other ways and finding ways that students can submit work, not necessarily like typed work, but that they could record themselves audio or video, send that to me. So I have tests, just basically I've put them on Blackboard now, but they're weighted much, much lower than I had weighted them in the past. I think because I can't proctor it, that was one motivation, but I really wanted to shift my philosophy in terms of assessment also, and I'm kind of seizing the opportunity to try to assess more on what they can tell me, what they can talk about math, and not just questions that they can come up with the numerical answer for. In terms of my participation with discussions, at this point, I'm not trying to envision a scenario where I would not participate. If they have a conversation going and it's just grooving and it looks great, I'll be very cautious about interjecting my thoughts, but I think I still want to at least let them know that I'm present. So maybe it's just encouragement, or maybe I can kind of push them a little more, challenge them some more. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not kind of thinking about the conditions in which I would want to take a step back, but I'm thinking more about how I'm going to continuously have some kind of a presence. And if they're struggling, then I'm going to have a greater impact on and presence in their conversations just to get them more productive. Best assessment techniques. I don't have them. This is like it's a journey, not a destination kind of thing when it comes to assessments. I'm trying everything. I'm having them write papers. That discussion board about the movies being more successful was something that in the spring I was developing into an individual paper. And now it is, as I talked about it, a discussion board that endures over many, many weeks. So those are additional kinds of assessments that I'm looking at. And if you give me one moment, I'm going to see if I can find the source for the 3CQ that I mentioned.
I think we're getting close on time here while he looks that up, but as far as assessment techniques, I think I'll have to agree with Aaron on this. We've always done tests, paper and pencil tests. Of course, that's harder virtually. I worry about, cheating and those sorts of things, even though we have an academic honesty statement we put on all of our tests. But I am really pushing toward projects, open-ended projects for my students. So I've piloted posters where students have to create a poster, take a picture of it, and upload it to our LMS. I have done professional letters where students have to write to a doctor and explain a medical situation. I have done PowerPoints where students have to, create a PowerPoint presentation. And I've done papers. So I've tried all of these. I'm not necessarily happy with any one of them yet, but I have tried them. And I do think having the open-endedness of it allows students to kind of choose, something that fits them a little better and is of interest to them. My PowerPoint presentation is a modeling where I have them compare buying coffee at a coffee shop versus making it at home. So something like that.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I see that we're a couple minutes past. So remaining questions that we find in the chat, we will respond to as far as our follow-up email. Thank you again for taking this time, and I hope you found something beneficial that you can incorporate in your courses. Thanks for joining us.